I still remember the exact moment I realized my wife no longer saw me as her partner. I was sitting at a long, crowded dinner table, thinking about my day at work, when someone asked, "So, how's married life treating you these days?" I glanced up, expecting Melissa, my wife, to jump in with something witty or affectionate. Instead, she rolled her eyes and dismissed me as just a roommate. Right there, in front of her entire friend group, she boiled our entire relationship down to a mere living arrangement. For a few seconds, it felt like my heart stopped beating, as though the air had been sucked out of the room. That single offhand remark told me everything I needed to know about how she really viewed me. I could feel my face burning as the others laughed, as if her words were the most natural joke in the world. One or two of them mumbled something about all husbands eventually becoming glorified roommates, and the rest roared with agreement. For them, it was just comedic chatter. But for me, that laugh was a funeral bell chiming the end of my marriage. It might sound dramatic, but it was the first time I fully understood just how little Melissa respected the partnership we once shared. But you might be surprised to learn that this wasn't the only shock I had coming. It was just the beginning of a story that twisted into betrayal, heartbreak, and an ultimatum that would change my life. When Melissa and I met, I was instantly taken in by her confident smile. She wasn't the kind of person who giggles behind her hand or looks down shyly. No, she had a striking presence that demanded your attention, warm, engaging, and bold, all at once. We connected through mutual friends at a local bar, trading jokes and phone numbers. We started texting incessantly, and within a month, we were practically inseparable. Late-night drives to the beach, weekend trips to see her family in another state, and endless conversations about our dreams and futures made me believe we were destined for an extraordinary life together. The first couple of years as a couple were truly magical. We had so many spontaneous adventures, driving to music festivals, trying out new cafes, even taking a last-minute flight for a 3-day trip to another city because we found cheap tickets. Everything felt fresh and exciting. We eventually decided to move in together, which felt less like a chore and more like a giant sleepover with your best friend. At that time, the very idea of her calling me a mere roommate would have made us both laugh out loud. But it's stunning how quickly love can morph into indifference, leaving you in the dark, wondering what just happened. Eventually, we tied the knot in a small ceremony surrounded by close friends and family. I was proud of our home, a modest place I had put a down payment on after countless hours working overtime. Melissa seemed genuinely happy too, or so I believed back then. We did the usual newlywed things, cooking together, heading out to the movies, window shopping in malls, and discussing our plans to start a family a few years down the line. For a while, it was exactly the life I'd hoped for, calm, loving, and collaborative. But sometime around the second year of marriage, a silent rift began to form between us. At first, it was subtle, a missed date night here, a working late text message there. Melissa, who worked in marketing, started complaining about an overwhelming workload. I respected her ambition. I even tried to shoulder more of the financial responsibilities, paying most of the bills so she could advance her career, just like she asked. What I never saw coming was how these small allowances would eventually tip the balance of our relationship so drastically that I'd feel like I was the only one trying to keep us afloat, and doing so without any thanks. Her schedule got crazier, and we spent less and less time together. Melissa started attending networking events, weekend work-related functions, and would come home late, either exhausted or still buzzing from social gathering. Whenever I gently brought up how distant we'd become, she'd snap at me, accusing me of not supporting her professional goals. Maybe I should have spoken up louder or told her that support goes both ways. But I didn't. I wanted to be the good husband, the one who doesn't stand in the way of his wife's success. Over time, we practically lived parallel lives. Sometimes she'd vanish for weekend brunches with friends I hardly knew, while I stayed home, tackling our chores or grocery shopping. Those tasks started to weigh on me. I had believed that, as a team, we'd pull our weight together, but it turned out the scale was tipping heavily in my direction, and that sense of imbalance only got worse. In fact, it would become so glaringly obvious that it overshadowed every part of our so-called marriage, turning love into resentment I couldn't keep ignoring. One night, months after we'd begun to drift, she unexpectedly invited me to a dinner with her friend group at a fancy new spot downtown. I figured maybe she was trying to include me more, to make an effort. It was a chance to reconnect, so I agreed. Even if her buddies weren't exactly the sort of people I naturally meshed with. These folks were marketing or PR professionals who thrived on gossip about industry drama and colleagues whose names meant nothing to me. So there I was, at a loud, crowded table, sharing space with about 8 people. Unfortunately, I found myself stuck between a bored colleague of hers who was glued to his phone and another friend who talked nonstop to the person on her other side. I felt invisible. Eventually, a friend across the table decided to liven things up by asking me, "So, how's married life treating you these days?" That's when Melissa's offhand remark completely shattered whatever illusions I had left, and if I thought the situation was salvageable before, that fleeting moment of humiliation told me otherwise. She said, "Oh, please, he's just my roommate at this point." I heard it clear as day, and she looked directly at me when she said it. It wasn't a giggly, light-hearted jab that couples sometimes share. It was a cold statement of fact, as if I should have already known I'd been demoted to the rank of nothing special. I felt the pit of my stomach drop. My face grew hot, my mind raced, and the chatter around me faded into a blur. Everyone else thought it was hilarious. Everyone except one friend named Olivia, who looked at me with genuine sympathy. I still remember that fleeting sense of relief. Someone else saw how messed up this was. But as soon as dinner ended, I had to ride home with Melissa, who acted like she had said nothing out of the ordinary. She scrolled on her phone, commented on random Instagram posts, and never once apologized or even acknowledged what she'd done. In that car ride, I started to realize that maybe Melissa really didn't view me as a partner at all anymore. If she did, how could she belittle me so casually and not care that I was sitting right beside her? Once we were back home, she planted herself on the couch, flipping through social media like it was a normal night. I just stood there, waiting for her to maybe say, "Hey, sorry about that joke. I was just being silly." Or even, "Did I hurt your feelings?" That never came. Instead, when I pressed her about what she meant, she rolled her eyes and dismissed me as oversensitive. I spent hours tossing and turning in bed, replaying the dinner in my mind. By morning, I felt this roiling mix of anger and sadness that wouldn't go away. I replayed all the sacrifices I'd made for her, buying the house, supporting her career, taking on extra household tasks. I couldn't shake the feeling that she saw me as little more than a live-in ATM. That's when an idea took root in my head. If she wants to treat me like a roommate, let's see how she likes actually living with one. I called it Operation Roommate. My plan was simple but transformative. I would stop doing the little extras that define a loving spouse. No more cooking for her, no more buying her groceries, no more covering her half of the bills, no more acting like a doting husband while she gallivanted off. Instead, I opened a separate bank account and deposited most of our joint money there, leaving just enough to cover exactly half of our monthly expenses. That first night of my new strategy, I ordered pizza, just enough for me, and retreated into the spare room to play games. When she came home, she couldn't grasp why I hadn't gotten dinner for her, too. She seemed confused at first, then a bit irritated. But I just shrugged it off. That was the moment the lines were drawn. If I was just a roommate, then I'd behave exactly like one. Still, I never anticipated how drastically this experiment would change my perspective, or how it would expose the ugly truth behind her late nights and unexplained absences. For the next couple of weeks, I maintained my distance and kept it strictly transactional. We shared the same house, but I no longer checked in on her day, asked about her projects, or offered to do her laundry. There was a cold civility between us that felt more disheartening every passing day. Surprisingly, Melissa didn't immediately protest. She still worked late, spent weekends out with friends, and barely acknowledged my existence beyond minimal small talk. But eventually, tension built. One evening, she came home to an empty fridge and snapped, "Didn't you buy groceries?" I calmly reminded her that roommates shop for themselves. She rolled her eyes, calling me childish for ignoring the fact that she was exhausted from work. Although I felt a pang of guilt, I reminded myself that she was the one who categorized me as nothing more than a roommate in the first place. Little did I know this was only the surface-level drama. Beneath it all, she was hiding something far worse, and I was about to find out in a way that was both humiliating and infuriating. It happened slowly, the suspicion creeping in. On the night she claimed she was working late, she'd come home wearing a faint cologne scent that was obviously not hers. She'd rush to the shower as soon as she got in, or sometimes avoid me entirely and claim she had an early morning meeting. At first, I tried to brush it off. I told myself I was being paranoid. Nobody wants to imagine their spouse is stepping out on them. Still, something didn't add up. She was unbelievably secretive with her phone, snatching it away from me even when I absent-mindedly reached for the television remote near where her phone lay. She started dressing more sharply for work gatherings, wearing outfits that seemed a little too polished for casual networking events. My gut told me there was more to it, but I needed real proof. I'd been cheated on in college and swore I'd never jump to conclusions without facts. But the moment I finally confronted the harsh reality that she was likely being unfaithful, my whole approach changed. I decided I wouldn't be made a fool of again. One morning, I found her car keys on the kitchen counter while she was still asleep. I'd heard about these tiny trackers people used called AirTags. With a mixture of shame and desperation, I bought one. Slipping it into a hidden compartment in her car's console was easier than I expected. I told myself I was doing it for clarity, for peace of mind, for evidence. But the truth is, I just had to know. I could no longer live in the limbo of wondering. Sure enough, that evening, she texted to say she'd be home late because she had a big project due. Instead of worrying, I calmly opened the tracking app on my phone. I watched as she drove to a fancy apartment complex nowhere near her office. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears I had to sit down. Over the next few days, I mapped out her movement, seeing the same location appear again and again. It's crushing to watch your worst suspicions turn into undeniable facts in real time, and yet part of me felt a twisted sense of relief. At least I wasn't losing my mind. I happened to cross paths again with Olivia, the one friend who'd shown me sympathy at that humiliating dinner. We were both grabbing coffee near my workplace. She recognized me first, offering a half smile and a question. "Everything okay?" I could tell she was genuinely concerned, not just making polite conversation. For reasons I still can't fully explain, I found myself opening up to her in a guarded way, telling her that Melissa and I were going through a rough patch. She listened, nodded, and admitted she'd never been comfortable with how Melissa talked about me in front of the group. That was the first time I realized that outside the boundaries of my marriage, there was a person who recognized my worth and found it appalling how I'd been treated. She gave me her number, saying, "If you ever need someone to talk to..." Little did I know how pivotal that tiny act of kindness would become, because in the days to come, everything in my life would go spinning off its axis. I watched Melissa's location every time she said she was working late. Every single time she ended up at the same upscale apartment complex, staying there for hours. One night, I couldn't stand the not knowing anymore, so I drove there myself and parked a little down the street. Sure enough, around 6:30 p.m., she showed up, fixed her makeup in the rearview mirror, and walked into the building like she belonged there. I wanted to run up those stairs and confront whoever was on the other side of that door, shout at them, demand to know why they were getting the version of Melissa that should have been mine. But I knew it wouldn't solve anything. Instead, I took pictures of her car in the parking lot and recorded the time she arrived, letting the cold finality of the evidence settle into my bones. There was no turning back from this. Sometimes, the hardest part of betrayal isn't the act itself, but the moment you realize you can't pretend it isn't happening. Once you've seen it with your own eyes, nothing is ever the same. I confided in Olivia more than I thought I ever would. We started exchanging texts, which led to meeting for coffee or lunch. She never once pushed me to leave or to stay. She just listened. Eventually, though, her concern slipped out in words, "You deserve someone who actually appreciates you." At first, I tried to brush it off, telling myself I shouldn't be drawn to another woman, not while I was still married, even if that marriage was falling apart. Yet, Olivia was my only sense of comfort at a time when I felt alone. Finally, I recognized I had no choice but to consider divorce. I contacted a lawyer, explained everything, and started building a case. The lawyer told me that because I'd bought our house before marriage and everything was in my name, I had a strong position. Plus, her adultery would also impact proceedings in my favor. A swirl of conflicting emotions drowned me. Sadness that it had come to this, relief that I could see a way out, and anger that she had pushed me to this precipice. And with that decision, a chain reaction began. The moment you involve lawyers, secrets, and evidence, you're on a collision course toward a final confrontation, one that can't be turned back. The day the papers were ready, the lawyer recommended I serve her by surprise, ideally with a witness present. My mind immediately went to Olivia. It felt like a leap, but I also had nobody else who truly knew the depth of what I was going through, or who had seen the cruelty of being called just a roommate. When I asked her if she'd be there, she didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, "whatever you need." We picked a Friday evening, knowing Melissa would be home. My heart thumped like a drum all day. I kept thinking about how swiftly everything had unraveled. In the morning, I'd had a wife, albeit a distant, possibly unfaithful one, and by nightfall, I'd effectively end our marriage. Whether she saw it coming or not, this was the day my entire life pivoted. It's eerie how final something can feel when you lay out the paperwork on your coffee table, preparing for the person you once loved to walk in and see the words that signal the end. Olivia and I met at a coffee shop near my house around 6 p.m. Melissa typically returned by 7 p.m. if she wasn't heading straight to her new friend's place. We took separate cars to my house, but once inside, there was an awkward pause. It wasn't about attraction or romance in that moment. It was about the gravity of what was about to go down. Olivia gave me a small, sad smile and told me I was doing the right thing. She sat with me on the couch, talking calmly, reminding me to stay firm. Then, right on cue, I heard the crunch of tires in the driveway. My chest tightened. This was it, the confrontation I dreaded and needed all at once. The door opened, and Melissa stepped in, her face scrunching with confusion when she saw Olivia. I could almost feel the tension crackling in the air, a silent warning that the next few minutes would change everything. Melissa demanded to know what was going on, throwing suspicious glances between me and Olivia. I stood and simply said, "We need to talk." She gave Olivia a sour look and snapped, "Why is she here?" I held out the envelope containing the divorce papers and told her, in the calmest voice I could muster, "She's here as a witness while I serve you these. I'm filing for divorce." Her expression slipped from confusion to outright horror. She barked out a laugh, calling me ridiculous and accusing me of overreacting to her roommate joke. But when I laid out the evidence about the apartment complex, the late nights, the constant lies, her forced laughter vanished. She began hurling accusations that I was tracking her, invading her privacy. Suddenly, it was all about me being the bad guy for discovering her betrayal. And through the rage, tears, and denial, I stood my ground. I'd lived in the dark long enough, and I wasn't about to apologize for uncovering the truth. She tried to switch tactics once her anger failed. A pitiful look, watery eyes, and vague promises of fixing the marriage. "We can go to counseling," she said. "We can start over." It was just a mistake. I felt a distant pang of sorrow remembering the woman I had once adored. But that same woman had humiliated me publicly, belittled my role in her life, and lied over and over. I just stared at her and said, "Funny how you're suddenly ready to treat me like a husband now that you're about to lose everything." When she realized I wasn't budging, she started calling me every name in the book, throwing pillows off the couch. The meltdown was loud and chaotic, but I kept my posture, letting her words roll off me. I could see Olivia out of the corner of my eye, standing quietly, arms folded, her expression a mixture of empathy and resolve. My resolve was set in stone. I would not go back to a life of being disrespected, lied to, and taken for granted. She had chosen her path, and I was simply finalizing the paperwork. Melissa stormed out that night. I replaced the locks the next day, sending her a text that she could gather her belongings on Saturday when I'd have my brother there to ensure it all went smoothly. It felt extreme, but I didn't trust her not to go ballistic or tear the house apart out of spite. This wasn't a simple breakup. We were severing a legal bond, and her rage felt unmanageable. Those hours after she left were emotionally dizzying. Part of me was numb, shutting down to keep from collapsing. Another part felt oddly free, like a weight had lifted. I kept replaying the word roommate in my mind, how casually she'd used it to strip away every meaningful element of our marriage. It's strange to think how someone could be so important one moment and so destructive the next. But the biggest surprise of all was how life didn't pause. The world kept spinning, and I was left to figure out the next steps that might lead me to a new beginning, or plunge me into a lonely aftermath. When Saturday finally arrived, I was ready. My brother Mike stood beside me as Melissa showed up with her father and her friend, presumably to intimidate me or maybe to shield her from confrontation. She glared at me when I opened the door, but I'd already mentally prepared for the worst. They started packing up her clothes, personal items, random decor she insisted on taking. She tried to provoke me with snide remarks. "I'll make sure you regret this, or you'll be alone forever." I quietly told her father that I'd prefer if any further communication went through my lawyer. He nodded, looking both ashamed and angry, as if he couldn't quite believe the situation either. And so, box by box, I watched the remnants of our shared life disappear. All the while, I kept thinking, this is it. There's no going back. Each item she carried out was like another strand being cut, freeing me from the web of broken promises and hidden truths. Later that evening, the house felt bizarrely empty, even though she'd only really taken some clothes, knickknacks, and a few electronics. What I felt most was the absence of tension. The looming threat that another argument was waiting around the corner was gone. I sat in the living room, staring at the spot where we used to watch television together. It felt like a lifetime ago. Did I miss her? Maybe I missed the person she used to be, or the person I thought she was. The current version of Melissa? I didn't even know her anymore. In the days that followed, the divorce process kicked into gear. The lawyer assured me that things were in my favor, given the evidence of her affair and the property details. There would still be the possibility of some negotiation regarding any joint assets, but overall, I was protected. Still, the emotional toll wasn't something any lawyer could fix. And in that haze of legalities and heartbreak, the only glimmer of genuine warmth came from the one person who had no obligation to care, Olivia. Olivia stayed in contact daily, sometimes just to check if I'd had dinner or to ask how my day was going. She confessed she felt guilty for being part of the friend group that had encouraged Melissa's bad behavior, though I assured her none of it was her fault. Oddly enough, our conversations became this safe space where I could express my worries without fear of judgment. One evening, she dropped by with groceries, insisting she'd cook something simple. I didn't know how to react at first. I was used to fending for myself for so long. But I let her in, and we talked in the kitchen while she prepped the meal. For the first time in what felt like forever, I enjoyed a quiet, comforting evening with someone who genuinely valued my company. And that's when I realized that sometimes, the end of one chapter can open the door to something unexpectedly beautiful, even if you're still afraid to believe it. In the weeks that followed, I began to see that what I'd mourned was more the idea of marriage than the actual relationship. Melissa had discarded me emotionally long ago, and I was holding on to the memory of happier times. With every conversation Olivia and I shared, I understood more clearly that I deserved a partner who saw me, who listened, who laughed with me, who didn't dismiss me as roommate material for a cheap joke in front of strangers. The divorce wasn't finalized yet, but I had mentally moved on. I was done playing the role of the neglected husband, and I was done letting guilt consume me for wanting something else. Olivia was the living proof that warmth, kindness, and genuine affection still existed in the world, even if it wasn't with the person I once said, "I do" to. Yet there was one more twist I hadn't counted on. Sometimes the person who's been wronged finds a new love, and the ex simply can't handle it. Melissa must have gotten word that I wasn't wallowing in misery as she'd hoped. Maybe she heard from mutual friends, or perhaps she saw me and Olivia having coffee somewhere. Whatever the case, she started leaving me voice messages, scathing rants about how quickly I'd moved on, and how heartless I was for abandoning her. She seemed to forget she was the one who'd had an ongoing affair. It was a bizarre turn, as if she wanted the sympathy of being the victim now. Part of me almost laughed at the irony. The woman who cheated called me her roommate and demanded space was now painting herself as the heartbroken wife. But I wasn't biting. I'd spent too long battling guilt, anger, and confusion to let her rewrite the narrative. I had my truth, my evidence, and more importantly, my sense of self finally returning. The final stretch of the divorce hearings went smoothly from a legal standpoint. Melissa tried to argue for spousal support, but given the documented infidelity and the fact that I owned the house before marriage, her claims fell flat. The judge didn't buy her victim act. When all was said and done, I was left with my home and a fraction of our savings given as a settlement, but I was free. Walking out of that courtroom felt like surfacing from a deep, dark ocean. I could breathe again. My brother patted me on the back, and Olivia was waiting outside the courthouse, wearing a small, respectful smile. In that moment, the reality of how far I'd come in just a few months struck me. I'd stepped out of a marriage that had turned toxic, exposed lies that would have eaten away at me, and maybe, just maybe, opened myself to the possibility of real happiness again. At the time, I didn't see it as a triumphant victory. It was more of a sober liberation, with the knowledge that I'd survived a harrowing ordeal that would always leave a scar. As I settled back into my new routine, I began reflecting on what happened, how two people who once loved each other dearly could become strangers sharing the same roof, how a throwaway comment about being just a roommate could hurt more than any insult, and how I never expected the random kindness of one person to guide me through the darkest period of my adult life. It's a strange thing, realizing that someone you vowed to love forever could become an unrecognizable antagonist in your story. Yet, there's also a sense of calm in acknowledging that relationships can end, and sometimes that ending is the best outcome for everyone involved. Olivia and I were cautiously exploring what it means to be more than friends. There's no immediate rush. We're both aware of the emotional baggage trailing behind me, but she's patient, genuine, and for the first time in years, I feel seen and appreciated. It's a delicate thing, trying to trust again after betrayal, but I'm taking it one day at a time, and whenever I catch myself hesitating, I remember how it felt to be called a roommate, to be disregarded and replaced. I remind myself that I deserve better, and no matter what the future holds, I won't settle for less, ever again. Conclusion. In the end, my wife's casual comment about me being just a roommate was more than a cutting joke. It was a warning siren for a marriage already on life support. Her repeated late nights, the deceptive cologne scents, the endless social gatherings that never included me, and the complete dismissal of my feelings were all signals I should have heeded sooner. Yet, we often cling to our illusions until the truth slaps us in the face so blatantly we can't ignore it. By the time I gathered solid proof of her affair and decided enough was enough, I was already emotionally gone. What remained was the legal severing of ties and the relief of shedding a relationship that no longer nurtured either of us. If there's one takeaway from my story, it's that respecting your own dignity matters more than preserving appearances. We can't force someone to value us, but we can walk away when they prove, time and again, that they don't. So if you ever find yourself at the receiving end of a relationship turned cold and humiliating, remember, you don't have to stay the roommate in your own life. Sometimes, stepping away is the only path to truly living again.